Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Ampire Media, Ampire. Always much appreciated when you tune in. Don't forget you can read my work on ESPN.com. Today, I'm joined by one of my favorite guests, former Washington Redskin tight end Logan Paulsen, now, of course, an analyst with the organization, does a lot of great work. He does work with Craig Hoffman on the Take Command podcast. He does work with the command center for the team. So always check his stuff out. But I always like having Logan on because it's a smart conversation. So today we're talking a lot about roster building, not just in the generic sense, but also areas he would attack, how he would approach it if he were the Commanders. Like, would you swing big? If so, what does that mean? And for who? What areas would you attack? All that good stuff. So, and then I also recorded another podcast with him for next week, just a short one about the combine, some fun stories from the combine, but also the value of the combine as well. So that'll be next Tuesday. And I will do another 5 things, I think, for Monday. So stay tuned for that. And for you Gold members, I'll be doing a private Zoom with you on Thursday night, 7:30 Eastern time. So join me there. So anyways, folks, nothing else going on. Here's my conversation with former Washington Redskin tight end turned Commanders analyst, Logan Paulsen. All right, Logan. So we've all kind of had a little bit of time to rest, although it's probably never enough. But I am curious now, after a couple weeks to process this, how would you approach roster building for the Commanders, if you're the Commanders this offseason? Like, what would be your approach toward taking that next step?
Yeah, I think the number one thing for me, just in terms of like reflecting, is kind of saying the most important piece on your team is Jaden Daniels. Like, how do you support him, right? And so right now you have, what is it, 26 free agent, 29 free agent, something like that. You need to sign probably 14 or 15 of those guys back, and then if you are unhappy with the other half of that kind of free agent group, you say we need to make sure that going into the draft we have a skeleton of a team, like someone we could go into a season with, and then I want to make sure that I'm using the draft as a way to kind of season or accent and infuse the roster with more young, cost-controlled talent. So that's kind of the main thing. And then so going back to the original point of like Jaden Daniels being the guy, I want to make sure that we find some way to improve the offensive line. We find another offensive playmaker, whether that's a running back, tight end, wide receiver, someone that, again, a young piece that we can kind of start developing rapport with Jaden Daniels. And I think not everything can be done in an offseason, but those are some things that I really want to make sure happen. I look at Kansas City and, when they're at their best, they're protecting Patrick Mahomes. They've provided playmakers for Patrick Mahomes. But I think the important thing too to note is the type of playmaker you're providing doesn't need to be this S-tier top flight playmaker necessarily, because the quarterback is so dynamic and he's able to improve that group. So making sure that Jaden Daniels is upright, we give him nice clean pockets. Again, Philadelphia Eagles are maybe the model, the archetype at the moment, but they keep Jalen Hurts upright. They let him hold the ball for 3.5 seconds. Like, you're going to look significantly better as a quarterback in those situations. Then you just compare that to Patrick Mahomes. In the 2 Super Bowls he's lost in recent history, it's when the offensive line kind of fell on its face. So just making sure that that's there to support them. I think improving on the offensive line allows you to be more efficient running the football. A lot of things. And again, that's not a criticism of the group that was here last year. I think I loved watching them play. I love the competitiveness. I love the brotherhood that they played with. But I'm just saying, can we get a little bit more talented, a little bit bigger, a little bit more physical? So that's kind of maybe the starting point for my offseason kind of, improvement.
And I stick there because I'm with you agreeing there, or I agree with you with all that. With the offensive line, does it matter what position you attack, or do you just say, and I look at Coleman, I think we've talked about this. Coleman offers you versatility as far as what you can go,
Yeah.
what you need to go get, and how you then can construct the line. But how would you attack that group?
Yeah, so for me, I think that flexibility is why you feel good about Coleman, right? So, like, for example, if Tyler Booker, for whatever reason, by some act of God, is there for you, he's the guard from Alabama, is there for you at 29, and you end up taking him, then Coleman can play tackle, right? If Connerly from Oregon, who's kind of the only other tackle in that group, or Ben Simmons, that would be truly a miracle if he's there at 29. But
Or
if one of
Josh
those guys,
Simmons,
yeah, Josh Simmons, sorry, Ben's
not the
basketball.
NBA guy.
Yeah,
If the
Josh
NBA
Simmons.
guy's there, then you may have, there's
Yeah,
something else going
different conversation. Yeah. So Josh Simmons is there. Like, I think he's special, and I think he's a special left tackle talent. But then you could move Brandon Coleman inside. And again, this is not a criticism of Allegretti, even though it might sound that way. Like, I am Allegretti. My career as a tight end in the NFL is Allegretti.
on.
You're always happy with the production that he brings, the professionalism that he brings, how he handles himself in the locker room. He's a good teammate. And that's how coaches referred to me. But ultimately, like, you're always knowing that you can get a little bit more talented at that spot. So I think that's kind of what I would look at there is either we get a better guard or we get a tackle and then bump Brandon Coleman inside and let him compete with Allegretti for that starting position. And just, again, just infusing the group with a little bit more talent, I think is the goal here, right? Just to kind of get, again, size, speed, weight, just improve that group a little bit. Because again, like, I think Andrew Wiley actually had a pretty solid year this year playing right tackle. But at some point, you want to make sure you're upgrading that position
Right.
and getting a little bit more dynamic. And that's across the board. Now, you can't do it all in one offseason, but I think you could easily improve it by getting a difference maker at either left tackle or left guard, and then kind of moving Brandon Coleman where you felt was most appropriate.
And then how does Sam Cosmi's injury play into this? Because it's funny because when it happened, you think, oh, okay, well, he'll be back, but like we don't know when he's coming back. It may not be if it's a 7 to 9 month range. So that you're talking possibly a month and a half into the season. So how would you approach that with all these, how would you factor that with all these moves?
Yeah, I think that's another reason why you feel like you have to kind of make a decision about offensive line, right? Because let's say, for example, we go left guard, right? Left guard, we draft somebody, we feel really good about him. Brandon Coleman stays at left tackle. We got Biotish at center. Now I can take Allegretti, who's been a swing guy his whole career, and put him at right guard till Sam comes back. And I think that's where I would look at it and say, like, that's why drafting or signing someone in free agency on the offensive line is critical, because you just need more bodies, again, to increase the talent level, but also account for this kind of unknown variable of Sam Cosmi and his injury recovery and his injury timeline, because those can be a little bit tough for the big offensive linemen in terms of how they handle the recoveries there, because they need so much strength in the lower half. So that's kind of why, again, another reason why I would prioritize making some type of influx of talent along that group. Again, I think it helps the run game. I think it helps with pass protection. I think it helps just with everything in an offense, but it also gives you some flexibility with Sam Cosmi's timeline.
And that Saints game kind of really opened my eyes a little bit, just with how physical they were and how they out physicaled this group. And just that's where, to me, I'm like, okay, you really do need to upgrade next year in whatever fashion. They're also very big, Logan, on competition.
Yeah.
So with that mindset, you should be looking to improve at any of these spots. I mean, I
Yeah, I
know
think
like
that
the odds should be hard to do, and Cosme are very good too. But the point is, like, I think adding competition should be a main staple of this group.
Yeah, I think that's something that I think maybe fans or people that aren't haven't been around the NFL a ton. Like, the best teams that I played for are always getting better. And when you're getting better, you're increasing competition at every position. And so, and it doesn't need to be anything crazy, but let's say, for example, like, I'll take my career, for example. Like, every year they would bring a veteran, especially when I was here in Washington, they'd bring a veteran free agent in to compete with me. And if I had a regression or if the other guy played better, then that guy would get the start. And so they, just by default, they got more out of me by increasing competition. And if the other guy played better, they got better at the position. And I think that's ultimately what you're looking for here, is just everyone says, oh, I really like player X. Like, I really like Terry McLaurin. This is a good example. I really like Terry. He should always be the starting extra receiver. But if I'm a GM, I want to bring someone in that's going to push Terry, going to push Terry for targets, going to push Terry for opportunities. Because ultimately, I know that Terry is wired mentally the right way to accept that competition, shake that guy's hand, but ultimately say, like, I'm going to be better than you. And so by getting a better version of Terry, the offense gets better, and we get a young, talented piece that also pushes Terry and also increases the dynamism of the offense. So that's where competition, to me, is of the utmost importance in the offseason strategy. It becomes a little bit challenging because they do have so many free agents. You have so many kind of balls in the air at once, if you will. But again, I trust Adam Peters to be able to get that done. He's a smart guy. He's got a great staff, and getting the backbone of the team back while also accenting it with those talents and those moments of competition, I think, are going to be a huge part of this offseason.
So let me ask you this: when they bring in competition for you, where did you find yourself responding? Is it like, hey, I'm going to do extra reps in the off season? How did you respond to make sure you stayed better than who they were bringing in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just it would kind of sharpen you up. And what I mean by that is like, hey, in the meeting, I got a coaching point, like I'm writing that down. I'm gonna do my pre-practice work to reflect that coaching point. My post-practice point is reflecting that coaching point. And then when I'm in the meeting, did I actually get it corrected or not? Because that's they've said what they want. They have another guy in here who's trying to do the same thing. So I know that if I don't get it done, I'm going to be out of here. Right. And I think like that's where it gets better. I get a little bit more competitive in practice. I was a little more physical in practice. I'd push it a little bit farther. I'd do a little bit more conditioning because I wanted to make sure that I had the edge for when we got to the preseason and I was ready to go. I was ready for that opportunity. And again, that's the thing about the NFL that people don't understand. There's always somebody waiting, right? There's always somebody in the wings. So you're not just competing with yourself, you're competing with the dude on this team, but you're also competing with the third tight end in Dallas who gets cut in the preseason or they trade for. Like you always have to be pushing that forward. And I think that's where you see it. And when you've got the right team, everybody responds the right way. Like everybody, like the fourth receiver says, I'm going to work a little bit harder on special teams, or I'm going to make sure I understand this run scheme, right? Because if I can do this, if I can own this run scheme, I'm going to be able to edge this other guy out who's maybe a better down to down route runner, but I have this physical element to my game that I can kind of, so it's a good thing. It stresses people out and it's not always the most comfortable thing, like when you're in it, but it does make you better. It makes the team better. And honestly, if you have a guy that like wilts when they bring someone else in, he's not the right guy. And I think that's another thing that's very telling is you want a team composed of self-starters, motivated individuals that are competitive, that are consistently getting better.
And it's funny because like that's true in everything. One of the
Yeah.
reasons I love being a reporter in this market because there are a lot of other good people here,
Yeah.
and it pushes you like, and it makes you like, okay, you have to look at something differently. You have to do this better. Okay, they did this. I'm going to talk to two more people for this story because I want to do better than what they did. And maybe you don't always do it, but it pushes you to do that. Would you see guys like who couldn't handle that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Like there'd be preseasons where it's like you'd see a guy who was having a pretty good camp, and then his competition would start playing well, right? They'd catch a couple balls or make a couple nice win one on ones as a pass protector, whatever it is, and they could feel the tide shifting. And instead of being able to readjust, re-ramp, get it going, they would just kind of wilt. They'd have a bunch of mental mistakes in practice. They would have bad body language. They wouldn't be putting in the extra work anymore, and they would just kind of crumble. And again, the NFL game is very stressful. It's very competitive, and I don't want a guy on my team who's going to wilt when it gets a little bit hairy. And ultimately, you're just weeding out kind of a weakness in the roster. And that's a tough thing to see because that happened to a couple of friends of mine, and it's really hard to be like, hey man, like I know feels bad, but you still got a shot and get that guy to remotivate, refocus. But it again, that's a weakness in the team that needs to be weeded out. And again, reward the guy who's doing what he's supposed to be doing.
So then looking at this too, with free agency coming up, and we're still like, there's lots going to change
Yeah.
between now and then with players being re-signed, the franchise tag, et cetera. But how would you approach that? And the reason I ask, and we kind of had a little text exchange about this, they have, a few older guys that they want to bring back.
Yeah.
How would you then approach free agency? What kind of guys would you look for to supplement what they need or have?
Yeah, I definitely think you want, like you want to bring Bobby Wagner back. You want to bring Zach Ertz back. But I think the thing is like for as good as Zach played this year, for as good as Bobby played this year, Zach was such a big percentage of this offense. You need somebody in development that you feel good about taking on that role. And maybe that's Ben Sinnott. I don't know. But again, like I want competition. I want contingency plans. So I'm going to try and find somebody, whether it's in the draft or in free agency, that's going to come in and compete with Zach and push him a little bit. And if something happens, Zach is ready to take on that role. Same thing with Bobby Wagner. Like I love Bobby. I love watching his film. I love his mindset, how he plays the mental game before each snap. But ultimately, like I need to make sure that I have someone that's kind of going to help my defense take the next step, a middle linebacker that can cover, that can run sideline to sideline, because Bobby's lost that ability. Again, he's, what is he, 34, 35 years old? Like that happens. Like this is not an indictment of him. It's just something that's inevitable. But I need to make sure that I'm preparing if I'm Adam Peters and if I'm this team for the next iteration of that. So that's kind of the way I would go about it, is finding guys that I think are good football players that can learn and grow with the tutelage and that are going to push these older guys a little bit more to make sure they stay on top of stuff. And whether that's in the draft or in free agency, but those are some things that I'm thinking about, especially at those two positions. Because again, like I cannot overstate how good Zach Ertz was this year
Yeah,
for this team.
yeah.
He was the guy that you could turn to consistently in man-to-man situations, third down, red zone, fourth down. Like he was the guy. You need to make sure that that percentage of the offense is accounted for in some way.
And so along with that, then when you're because you can find some of those guys possibly in the draft.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking in free agency, are you looking like what type of players are you looking there? Do you want some more like Khalil
Oh,
Mack's name will
interesting.
come up, other names, or are you looking for guys more along the Luvu line who maybe aren't quite as good as like a Khalil Mack is right now, but will be here for 3 years at a certain level of impact? How
Oh,
would you
dude.
approach that?
Absolutely. I'm looking for like when I look at the roster right now, there's not a lot of like backbone to it, right? It's very transient. There's not a lot of young guys that are developing. There's not a lot of it's old veterans and then the kind of like the staple guys that are under contract, which again they did a good job of last year. You
Right.
know, you signed Frankie Luvu, you signed Biotis, you signed Dorrance Armstrong. All those guys were significant contributors to this team and significant contributors to the cultural identity of the team. So hugely important. I think you want to go out and do something very similar. Bring guys in that you know are going to be good players. You have a vision and a role for. That's where like the Jeremy Chin re-signing, I think could be really interesting because he feels like he's at the right age. You give him a 3-year contract and he could settle in and kind of be one of those pillars on the defensive side of the football for you for a couple of years, right? Especially in the role that he's in. You have a very clear identity for that position. So when people say Khalil Mack, it's like what's why him? It's because you recognize his name, and I understand that as being an important part because he's a good player. He's earned that name recognition. But what is his runway with this team? Is he going to be here in 3 years? Is he going to be as effective in 3 years as he is now? Because Frankie Luvu, I know, is going to get better for the next 2 years. He's going to be a heck of a football player. He's got a very clear role in this defense. With Khalil Mack, I don't see that. So, like, why? Like, you bring him for veteran leadership? If that's why you're bringing him in, understand that's why you're bringing him in. It's going to be a 1-year deal. You're going to be doing the same song and dance next year. So to me, if they did bring Khalil Mack in, I'd be super excited, right? That'd be super fun. Like, because again, experienced, professional, good pro. But I also want to see them, and again, they've done this. So I want to see them continue doing it of building the backbone and the scaffolding of the team with players they've identified that they want to be here and a part of this thing moving forward.
Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking about with Khalil, like if they signed a guy like that, and I don't know that he would want to leave the West Coast again. I was told he's got a house he's building in Beverly.
Yeah.
I was like, I think you probably, let's just say he probably wants to stay out there. But if you got a guy like that, and then maybe you draft a guy, so
Yeah.
maybe you take a James Pierce who like, hey, pass rushers take a year or so to develop, but while this guy's developing, you've got this veteran.
Right.
So, that to me would be one way to do it. But the other thing is, Logan, I think it also depends on how do they view this roster.
Yes.
It's like, do they view it as like, hey, one or two pieces away for this year? Or do you say there's still some work to be done and you can build something that's more sustainable by taking a certain approach this offseason?
Yeah, and I think that's the tough question because they've been very close-lipped about the
Right.
roster, and I'm always a big believer like get better when you can get better. And like I think teams make this mistake often of thinking that I've been a part of. Let me say that they're closer than they are when that they're closer than they are. And
Right.
so what I mean by that is like they say, "Oh, we are 2 players away." Maybe, but like you're accounting that everybody on the roster is going to continue to get better. I want to make sure that I'm troubleshooting the roster for when we do make that run, we have the depth, we have the athleticism, we have the physicality that we want at all positions. And I think if you were to go down the roster this year, there's only a couple positions that I'd say are like impeachable, right? Like guys who are like you mentioned Tyler Biotis, we mentioned Terry
Right.
McLaurin, Jaden Daniels on the offensive side of the ball, Sam Cosmi when he's healthy, right? That's 4 pieces. I think everybody else, if you were to find somebody better, I think you would bring that person in and be very excited about it and build that thing up. It's the same thing on the defensive side of the football. So you're not one or two things away. But I don't think that's the thing is I don't think any team is one or two things away. Maybe if you're Detroit or maybe if you're I don't know, the Eagles, you're one or two pieces here and there. You got to re-sign, got to kind of plan for, oh, this person's departing in free agency. Like, I don't think this team's there yet. We're not a top five roster in football. And so until you're in that pantheon of people, like you're always getting to hunt and peck and improve and find ways to get better. And I think that's the crux of this. And so to your question is, how do you do that? You got to make smart, selective free agent decisions, very similar to what they did last year, smart, selective decisions in the draft, and slowly build this thing out. It takes a couple years to build a roster. And I think, when I was talking to teams, other executives around the league last year coming into last year's offseason, they were like, that roster's far away. And so it's not because there was a good season, all of a sudden very close. It's still got a lot of work to do. And I think that's important to keep in mind for fans moving forward. And because I think it's something Adam is acutely aware of. And I haven't spoken to him. I just know he's a smart guy.
Yes.
and thinks about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, even at the trade deadline, like you would hear that they're aware of where the roster is at. And I think it also highlights how good Jaden Daniels was. But so along those lines, like the Myles Garrett thing comes up a
Yeah.
lot, right? Would you make that move?
Yeah, I think I would. And this is where it becomes a little bit weird. It's like, yeah, I like a Ferrari, right? I love a Ferrari, but how much does a Ferrari cost, right? Am I getting one that's used that I can afford, that's going to be good value for me? Then of course I'm going to buy it. But if it's something that I can't afford that doesn't fit with the plan, so it really depends to me on what Cleveland wants. Like if Cleveland's like, hey, we'll give you Myles Garrett for your first, a second, first next year, and then we'll give you Myles Garrett in a second this year, like that's a pretty reasonable trade. It stings a little bit, but like I'm 100% down for that. Like, but if it's something where there's way more draft capital involved, it's something that's going to really kind of shake the table of how effective I can be in terms of building my team through the draft. And this is something that I was talking about with Fred Smoot. Yes, the draft is unknown in terms of player talent, but the thing that where the value lies is it is a cost controlled asset for 5 years. You're just throwing those opportunities away when you trade for a guy like this. Now you're trading for what you think is a sure thing, which I understand the value of that, and a difference maker, a defensive MVP caliber player. And that's why I'm engaged with this, right? I don't like trading a lot. I don't like trading away draft capital, but when it's for a player like this, it's definitely something I think about. And it just comes down to what is the cost, and is it the right cost for me? And does it still allow me to build the team the way I want to build it, or is it detrimental to that vision? If it's detrimental to that vision, then it's something I got to be a little bit leery of, I think.
And I think the other thing too with him, a guy like that, whether it's him or somebody else, but in that range, still in his prime, and
Yes.
still would be, at the tail end of his prime during this period where you feel like, the Jaden Daniels contract where you want to take advantage of that. So like he fits in that where he could still play at a certain level for the next 3 years versus someone else who maybe comes here for one, maybe get him cheaper, but are you getting the multi-year impact, which it seems like I would guess they would want.
No, I think that's 100% right. It kind of goes back to the thing we were talking about. You want to make decisions where you can build the backbone of the team. Your Tyler Biotish, your Frankie Louvu, your hypothetically Jeremy Chin, your Dorrance Armstrong, where you've got a little bit of runway, cost controlled, talented players that fit your vision. And again, with Myles Garrett, you bring him in. It's expensive, but he's going to be here for 3 years. And so he's a foundational piece of the roster that you can kind of continue to accent as you move into this playoff window, quote unquote, with Jaden Daniels playing quarterback. So I 100% think that's why it feels good. Good player, controlled contract for a certain amount of time in your window while you can afford it. Because again, you don't have to pay the quarterback. So I think that's another thing that's so important when looking at that trade.
Receiver, how would you assess? Because like there are some interesting names that are going to be available.
Yeah.
T. Higgins we don't know what's going to happen with him, but do you feel like you can get what you need at a lower cost at that position?
I do. I think you can get what you need at a lower cost. And it's a big reason is because of Jaden Daniels. It's the same thing you saw with Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Joe Burrow to a certain extent, Patrick Mahomes to a certain extent. You don't need to go out and find top flight talent. I think look at last year, like with Noah Brown, De'Ami Brown, Zacchaeus, Crowder, like those guys were all kind of two caliber receivers for this team last year. And I think they're all very talented, but Zacchaeus was a 3 2 years ago. Crowder was the 4 in Buffalo. Noah Brown was cut by Houston. And again, like you found excellent A-plus football players that could fit a role and fit a cultural identity on the team. And you didn't have to pay top dollar because of who you had playing quarterback. Now, I do think there needs to be a priority. We just talked about it with Zach Ertz, to find more weapons that can consistently win versus man-to-man coverage. There are some guys in the draft that you feel pretty good about. Again, it's not a very deep wide receiver class, deep tight end class. You could find another tight end that you could bring into the offense. There are some running backs that catch the ball very well. There are some people that do both. They play receiver and play running back, right? So there are ways to bring juice to your offense through the draft. But if I'm looking at free agency, I think this is where fans always, every year this happens. They hear a name, they think this is the only way. There are multiple ways to get there. And I think Jayden Daniels gives you more flexibility in this category. Now, you don't want it to negate helping him by finding people that can win versus man-to-man coverage that can be dynamic, but it doesn't need to be T. Higgins, I don't think. Because again, there's other elements to the offense that I think you want to invest money there. Like I would almost be more interested in like a Ronnie Stanley signing. And again, Ronnie Stanley's an older player, but you see tackles with athletic upside that can do that. Again, his injury history is a little bit up and down.
That's the only thing that concerns me with him is that.
And
otherwise, he'd be really good.
And I'm not saying they should sign him, but I'm saying that to me is more interesting than a top flight wide receiver because, again, you're getting a consistent piece for that offensive line, a consistent piece of mentorship. So, again, Ronnie Stanley is just a name that fits that mold. But if there's a talented player in free agency on the offensive line, I would be more inclined to lean that direction.
Because there's also like the Alaric Jackson, there you got Cam Robinson.
Yes. Yeah.
Stanley would be interesting again, because then to me, the injury history scares me. That could knock his price tag down.
Yeah.
But then if you get him and you find someone to develop, now you're developing depth as you have a guy for a year. But I also, what do you think like Jackson, Robinson?
I think those would be really interesting signings. Again, they're not perfect players. Jackson to me is really interesting. I think he plays with great length. He's got good power. He kind of fits what they would do here from a run game standpoint. I think relatively well. I don't know how comfortable you feel with him about pulling all the time, but a really go ahead.
I was going to say one thing when I watched him, I didn't see the pulling action, but you see that he can move. So
yeah, he's a good athlete. He's long, like again, effort's a little up and down, but I like him. Cam Robinson is who Cam Robinson is. He's slightly above average, and that's what this team needs is someone that is going to pass protect at a high level and, again, give you just kind of a floor to the offense. So those guys are really interesting to me. And again, like what price tag, situation, fit, interviews, all those types of things are super important. But I think those guys I would definitely kick the tires on those guys for sure. And again, probably a little bit more than Ronnie Stanley because the injury history, but those guys to me are very high priority.
Last thing, Ben Sinnott, we talked about his development, and I wonder where he could go and how that impacts what they might do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see what they do. I think, again, when you go back and watch this film and kind of review the season, you see the athlete, you see the physicality, you see the mindset, and I think that's all good stuff. But also, I think you see a little bit of kind of the mental fatigue of his first year in the NFL. And so that's something where I would just say, like, can he take this offseason, reflect, recharge, kind of refocus, and then get back to it? So that's something that I would kind of look at there with him and say, where are we at? Can we get there from a mental? It's not a physical thing. It's more of a mental professionalism thing, at least from the film. And I haven't talked to anybody over there, but that's something that sticks out to me is, can that improve? If it can, great. I think you got to really, again, the physical stuff is there. It's the other stuff you got to kind of think about.
Logan, always appreciate your time and insight. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, bud.
That's it for this episode. Thanks as always to Logan for joining me, and thanks to you for tuning in. I'll be back on Monday with another episode with more 5 Things I Think as we head into Combine Week. I'll talk to you next time.